Hey everybody, Cheri Dotterer here, your host here at The Writing Glitch. For the last couple months, I've been running a webinar and I thought I would share it with you. So this episode was pre-recorded at another time and I wanted to share the webinar with you. At the end, there's going to be an offer for a course bundle that I have created through my work with Jonily Zupancic. So at the end, you'll see what I'm talking about. But if you want to go right down now into the show notes and click on that offer, I will have it ready for you whenever you want to start. Talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.
Hey everybody, how's it going today? So today we are going to talk a little bit about three interventions to help folks with math. Now, how this got started was I was doing an evaluation on a third grader. I am an occupational therapist, and this third grader was having trouble with spelling. My gifted daughter, who was getting like hundreds on everything, comes in, I can't spell, I can't spell. I'm like, what are you talking about? You can't spell. Here, it was like one word that was throwing her 100% off kilter, and she just couldn't get over the perfectionism that she had. But it got me to thinking because the more I delved into gifted students, the more I found out that they often have trouble with writing. But then I realized that after getting a request from a parent that kids also have trouble with mathematics a lot of times, and there's splinter skills. Like sometimes they're good at it, sometimes they're not. But with this one kiddo that I had that was with a learning disability, he was trying to do fractions. And mom had this pie chart, and he had to figure out what a quarter of the pie chart was and just couldn't do it. Fast forward to around 2018, I met Jonily Zupancic, who happens to be on the call at the moment, and she is a math teacher and has a very unique way of teaching math. And so I have been learning from her and practicing how and learning how to integrate the subject matter into writing skills, because writing is more than just literacy. It is all communication. So being able to write complex numbers and problems on a piece of paper is just as much writing as it is to craft a very detailed letter. I mentioned I am an occupational therapist. The people that are on the call at the moment know who I am. I wrote Handwriting Brain Body Disconnect. I participated in an anthology with 15 other authors, and I have a chapter in a textbook on handwriting. Jonely and I are writing a book, which we don't have a title for it yet. I just wrote the first draft of a historical fiction. I know it sounds like it's out there in Never Neverland, but I needed to practice my own disability of writing and being able to write creatively versus the handwriting brain body disconnect, which is more of a technical book. I needed to practice that. I also have two podcasts, The Writing Glitch, and I share one with Jonily, Tier 1 Interventions. The one on the left is more about writing skills. The one on the right is more about math skills, but they're both about the cognitive science of learning. And my courses are on disability labs. So I have a question for you. Have you ever watched a toddler play? They stack, they sort colors, they're very creative and imaginative, but the whole time they're doing that, they see numbers as shapes. They see triangles as, although they getting to know them as triangles, they might be counting them. They might be seeing how they integrate with other shapes. You've heard the saying, a square peg in a round hole and vice versa. It just doesn't work. Well, when they're toddlers, they're trying to figure that out. They aren't they're not solving formulas, they're not memorizing. They're maybe mimicking, but they're also being very creative, and they'll approach things in ways that we've never imagined. Numbers as shapes, recognizing patterns and sticking with it is really the area that I've been working with. And that is, how do we get kids to see numbers as shapes? How do we get them to recognize patterns and see that long-standing impact so that they recall the information in weeks to come? How do the interventions that we create align with brain processes and don't negate learning? How do we enhance it? How do we recognize and synthesize numbers into our everyday activities? How do we sequence them with our relationships to patterns and sorting and categorizing? Do we see them? Some kids just know them. Some kid makes make a lot of mistakes along the way. And how do we take those mistakes and turn them positive so that they can see that their mistakes were a way of thinking and not incorrect thought, because their mistakes are the way their brain sees their environment. And last but not least, how do we get them to solve what we need them to solve? We use manipulatives. We need to break the cycle of fear and frustration. That's the first thing we need to do. We need to break that frustration before we can ever be successful at math or writing implementation. We need to shift their mind so that they can tackle that challenge. And that sounds like, oh, yeah, that sounds easy, but yet it also sounds like a nightmare all at the same time. How can we get them to critically think through the patterns efficiently so that they can solve the problem? Today, what I'd like to do is I'd like to share 3 of the tasks that Jonily has put together to solve problems from K through 12th grade. Now, how do I get involved? What I have done with her problems is I've created adaptations. So I'll explain some of those as we go through these problems today. There is Jonily and I, so you have a face that goes with the name. One of the things is we don't memorize the Pythagorean theorem. We don't necessarily sit down and memorize pi. We're not looking at those kind of things, although they are very helpful to some students when we add that sing-song to it. That is not the focus of what we're doing. But we have discovered that as little as 6 minutes a week, we can change kids' outcomes. Jonily participated in 2 math research studies. The first one was with a 6th grade cohort. At the end of their 5th grade year, before they ever had any intervention, their proficiency level on the end of state testing was 27%. So what the powers that be in the nation is that we have the basic, the proficient, and the advanced levels. Basically, all of the national reports are divided into those 3. 27% of these kids landed in the proficient category. With that 6 minutes a week of intervention, 60%, the scores at the end of the year were 60% proficient instead of the 27, and 92% of the kids had growth. In study number 2, this had a few more students in it, had 130 students in it. At the end of the year scores, before they had any intervention, the proficiency levels were 50 to 65. This was partial implementation, so it wasn't quite 6 minutes a week, but over 2 years. But here again, kids improve their proficiency levels. So before I get into the some of the math ideas, does that sound like something that you'd be interested in learning more about, Angelica?
Yeah.
I know Emily is. Our first thing is division is sharing. Sorry, I thought you were on silent. And I didn't turn it on do not disturb because my daughter just went to the ER. She should be okay. But I didn't want to turn it totally off, so forgive me if I keep looking down at my phone. I'm just making sure it's not her. Division is sharing. So let's think about this. Suppose you have two kids and you needed to share an uneven number with each one of them. How are you going to do that? How are they going to divide it? How are the kids going to plan out how that gets divided? How about this scenario? We have 100 students with 100 lockers. Tell me about that. Emily, what do you think? Tell me what first comes to your mind when you think of 100 students and 100 lockers. She may not be able to. Angelica, how about you? What do you think of when you think of 100 students and 100 lockers?
One locker per student.
Okay. Anything else?
That's a lot of lockers.
It's a lot of lockers. I think mayhem.
Yeah.
I just see the mayhem coming. But for a kiddo who is in kindergarten who may not have an older sister or brother, the concept of a locker may be they have no idea. Where if you just ask kids about lockers, they're going to come up with all kinds of stories even before you start the math. But lockers don't have to be the object of this scenario. You could use cards, you could use Roblox, you could use almost any object to create this scenario. It's just lockers are something that middle school kids know about. Some ways to help with the lockers is sorting. The lockers behind the sign there are color coded, so they're grouped in groups of two. We could do some sorting if they weren't attached to the wall, but kids could sort them by knowing how much of something that they were looking for within the lockers. We also might talk and have discussions about equal versus unequal with the lockers. And we could be looking for patterns. So what is this problem? Oh, I'm just going to hang out there for a moment. So what is this problem? The locker problem has to do with building math and interactions with math and interactions with counting. I know where I was going. I wanted to go to this page over here. So this only has 24. What's the relationship between 100 and 24? It's a question, and who knows how the kids are going to answer that. What is So one of the things we discovered is by having 100 on one page, it's a lot smaller. We have another scenario where we have 100 on one page, but in this particular worksheet, when we're working with the kids with this one and we're talking about the locker problem, we're essentially working on counting skills. What happens when we're counting by ones? What about by twos, fours, eights? What happens if we count by 50? What happens if we count by 77? What are the the scenarios, and how can we have kids create their own questions based on the scenario that we're talking about? So, what happens with this one is all the lockers begin closed. Student number 1 opens all the lockers. So on the worksheet, they're flipping like Othello pieces, so the black and white, the two color math pieces are red and yellow. So think Othello. So we go in black and white. So if they start out black, all the pieces on the paper are getting flipped over to white. Student number 2 touches every other locker, and he either opens or closes them. Since they're already all open, student number 2 is going to close them all. But he's only touching every other locker, so he's touching 2, 4, 6, etc. And some of the questions that we may facilitate are, what happens with locker number 77? Does student number 2 touch that? And so we create a discussion with the kids as well as an experience with them. Student number 3 is going to touch every third locker. And what I have here on the next slide is a picture of what it might look like using the red yellow pieces that they have in math class. If we start with red being closed, locker number 1 is open, 2, 3, and 4 are closed. So if student number 3 is touching every third locker, this is what it might look like on the paper. So then we start building in that pattern recognition. We start building an awareness of counting. We may talk about evens and odds along the way. How I have done an adaptation to the worksheet is I've created one that has thicker lines and thicker numbers. And for some kids, the open and closed, they need to see it. They can't grasp that by just the color. I've added some open and closed. So how I worked with Jonily is looked at the adaptations. So as we look a little bit later at some of the things that I have to offer later, all these adaptations are included. Subtraction is distance. We utilize a 120 chart instead of a 100 chart. The reason we do that is because so many kids were getting stuck at 100. They didn't know what happens after 100. So by adding and including 101 through 120, they filtered out and they got the pattern. So they could figure out from there what 121, etc. were. This is great for skip counting. Skip counting, they can start with ones and count every other to learn the odds. They can work on factors. They can work on all kinds of different ways to manipulate this, but they can see the numbers in front of them. So it helps them to see that. And I have one that I've decapitated. Where did it go? There. I was working with a student earlier today, and we cut one of the lines apart and created a number line. Another adaptation that I have done with the 120 chart is make it on a double sheet and we have one that's on 4 sheets for kids that are having trouble with their vision. Here I give an example of covering up the 8s tables. Do you see the pattern? Do you see the diagonal? Having kids become aware of these patterns is their eyes just light up because they're not being asked to solve any problems at this point. They're just experiencing numbers. They're experiencing numbers, they're experiencing shapes and patterns. Things like the 8s tables become visual to them. It's less about 8, 16, 24 and more about where is it located on the 120 chart and what does the pattern look like. We can turn distance into a game. Like Chutes and Ladders. And that we like how many tens is it going to take to get from 55 to 77? And starting in odd locations helps kids relate to numbers better. The third concept is multiplication is rectangle. And this one we start out with paper. So while we're working on paper, you see this guy is making an origami. He's folding paper and touching it against the table. One of the things that we've discovered is kids need sometimes to move the folding of paper up into the air and fold the paper this way instead of against the table. And that was one of the adaptations that I have incorporated into the math. So we start out with strips of paper rather than origami squares. And the first thing we have them do is fold the paper in half. We ask them to make a prediction. How many parts do you think there will be? So, Angelica, you're the only one that I can really talk to at the moment. How many parts are there going to be?
In the half, you said?
Yeah, I folded it once. How many parts do you think it'll be? Two. So
Two.
we open it up and prove it. 1 part, 2 part. We might do it again. We bring it to the top, we fold it. I've also used this as notes. So sorry, there's numbers all over it because I used it as notes. 1 part, 2 part, 3 part, 4 part. And let's try it again. Prediction. How many parts are there going to be?
8.
I love the way the eyes closed because you closed off one of your sensory pathways. You thought, so that was that whole metacognition. You thought about what you were doing, and then we have to prove it that there are indeed 8 parts. 1 part, 2 part, 3 part, 4 part, 5 part, 6 part, 7 part, 8 part. And as Jonily was teaching me this technique, I'm going, okay, I got all these kids that have trouble with folding, all these kids that have trouble with cutting, all these kids that have trouble with things in general. I said, what about cardstock? So we started playing around with cardstock. Yes, you can fold cardstock into 8 parts as well. And when you open it up, there's a little bit more texture. So when you open it up, they have a little bit more stability, a little thicker so that they can hold it better. So these kids that are struggling with fine motor skills have a resource as well. So when we're folding things the first time, Jonily might put something up on the board that looks like this, and she might put half instead of 0.5 or 1/2 or all of those variations of half, especially for those kindergarten and first graders who've never heard the term. And then 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, and 1/8. And then another thing that we do, and I put it all on one slide so that you could see it. If we did one end at 0 and one end at 60, we could talk about minutes on a clock. You could do 0 to 12 and talk about the numbers on the clock, the hour. You could also go 0 to 100 and talk about dollars. You could go 0 to 1 and then talk maybe about a half a mile or 3/4 of a mile. And then if you get them to mark, you could put the 30 in the middle, the 45 and the 15 on here. And if you do, this is like the most brilliant thing she's ever created. The analog clock. After you've counted it, we went from a rectangle, created the circle. And if I would have known this when I had that 3rd grader, I think he would have understood because he got rectangles. He was not getting the circle. So by changing the most difficult part of mathematics into the easiest part of mathematics, it changes their understanding of the complex amounts of parts of mathematics. And you can create number lines on the pieces of paper, and you don't necessarily have to fill in all the numbers. You can create whatever you need to along the way. One of the little tricks that I didn't say was put your numbers on the crease rather than in the space because it confuses people. When I'm doing paper folding with words and stuff, that's when I put it between. So we can work on fractions and skip counting. We can work on time, distance, and money. Angela, I'm going to pause there. What was the aha that you had so far with this process and this thought and these? So what's your takeaway so far?
I thought I like the new way of thinking of these different terms of division as sharing, subtraction as distance from one number to another. And then fractions as skip counting was something that I'd never thought about, but that's true. So just like rewording that, like if they have a good concept of one thing and being able to, or a good grasp of one thing and being able to relate it to something else to help them understand it.
Emily, I don't know if you're able to put anything in the chat, but you're welcome to share as well. Oh, do you think that you would have time in your day to implement little pieces of these ideas? If not, you weren't listening to me because it was 6 minutes a week. That's not much. Even as an OT who is seeing kids for 30 minutes, I can grab 6 minutes to show them a little something about mathematics. What if my school won't support this? This can be applied to any math curriculum. It doesn't have to be a standalone system. It is part of cognitive science, and incorporating cognitive science into mathematics will help boost their retention. Why should I try this approach? I just mentioned it because it's part of cognitive science. What if I tried other math interventions before? What can you do? You try it and it just doesn't work. Well, what we have proven time and time again is kids have better memory retention and focus and engagement with it. So even if you've tried other problem interventions, this one is one that would just blow you away. What if my students are in middle school and high school? That's where this began. Jonily was an 8th grade teacher when she started working on this. I've applied it mostly to the kindergarten through 2nd grade level, but she has applied it K through 12. What if I don't have any strong math skills myself? I don't. I fumble through it every day. All right, you and I, Angelica, you and I have talked, Emily, you and I have talked about different things, but the locker problem was the first thing that we talked about. What we have put together is a 2.5 hour workshop on each one of the problems, teaching you how to use it from K through 12th grade. There's transcripts and audio files of the workshop as well. So in case you want to listen to it in the car, you don't have to have the video on. You can just use the audio file. Jonily has had the opportunity to record herself teaching. In the locker problem, there's 5 hours worth of audio files of her teaching 30-minute sessions to K through 8th grade. There's classroom worksheets, there's task packets, and there's OT adapted work. The task packets, I didn't really mention yet. The task packets are packets that the kids have created their own questions, and we just keep building on to these packets with the student questions. And then during independent time, they have these task packets to answer the questions for themselves. As far as the locker problem goes, from a fine motor standpoint or from an OT standpoint, we work on fine motor skills, in-hand manipulation, counting, left-right discrimination, orientation, and turn taking. With the 120 chart, the biggest thing is 8 hours of audio files. That's just gold in itself. And plus she has everything else that I've mentioned before. And as far as the 120 chart goes, we look at pattern recognition, dexterity, counting, taking things from a concrete to an abstract level. And it really does impact their social emotional connections with numbers. Paper folding, there's 11 hours. There isn't as many task worksheets because it being such a concrete object, but it does help with time, distance, money. And this is also something that really affects that social, emotional, and social sensory processing part of connecting with mathematics. Those three programs, if you bought them all individually, would be $891. I have created a 6-week plan for how to implement that to kids who are struggling, to help it foster thinking, facilitate collaboration, engage pattern recognition, activate hands-on fun, and empowering positive executive function. For parents, I do the 6-week course alongside them. So I'm working with homeschool parents to apply this. So I have some case studies that I've been working on with the homeschool population and how it has changed their kids' application of mathematics. If we add that on at another 297, that comes to 1188. I'm also including in this package today my book at Handwriting Brain Body Disconnect, along with the daughter dysgraphia method, which Angelica, you and I have talked about. It's an 11-week course. It helps build the relationship between reading and writing and mathematics. It helps create that, it gives you that neurobiology of what's going on in the brain to apply the cognitive science. So not only do you get the actual mathematics, but you also, with this, you get the application of how to implement cognitive based interventions. I have over 100 stimulus that you can use that are just images that you can use to create conversation with the kids that don't apply to mathematics. I know that's one thing that you're interested in, and that is converting to getting your dysgraphia specialist and working with your district center. This is new, and this is the first time I'm offering this. I have tried doing the practicum over every week meeting and have the practicum done by the end. It was overwhelming everybody who took it. I've tried doing monthly meetings. It seems to drag it out and people don't get distracted. This is the first time I'm going to try it. I'm going to try bi-weekly so that we meet every other week. It gives you a little extra time, but it doesn't drag out for an entire year. Adding that onto that, it comes to nearly $2,000. There's also a bonus course that I am including for $297. With all of that, I am offering this whole package to you for $497. So for the price of the practicum, I'm offering all of it to you. Do you have any thoughts or questions? No? And I know you're ready to purchase.
Yeah.
I know you're ready to purchase, but I also wanted you to see some of the mathematics. Let me stop sharing